Hi folks, welcome to a thrilling new episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. I'm your host Mathieu Peteau, and today we're talking with Aaron Painter, who's an entrepreneur in access management, and he's going to tell us all about how we can make better medical devices by making them more secure through better authentication. Aaron, welcome to the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast.
Thanks, Matthias. I'm excited to be here with you today.
Awesome, Aaron. Can you tell us in a few lines who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name's Aaron Painter. I'm the CEO of a company I founded about 5 years ago called Nametag. Prior to Nametag, I spent about 14 years at Microsoft, most of it based outside the US, working to develop Microsoft's international markets, particularly across Europe, Asia, and South America. And 5 years ago, at the start of the pandemic, I had several friends and family members who had their identity stolen. And I said, I'm going to be a good friend, I'm going to be a good son, we're going to figure this out. And every company that we called to try and fix things, it turned out before they could help us, they had to ask these security questions, which you might have experienced, but sometimes are very easy. What's your favorite color, or what's your last name or email? And sometimes very hard. What street did you live on, and whatever year it might be. And we realized that someone had called before us and they answered those questions and they were able to take over our accounts. And so it led to this key insight that, as strong as authentication might be, or, signing in or multi-factor authentication and things like that might be, that fortunately the greatest weakness is not necessarily in that technology, it's in the social and human processes of someone saying that they are locked out or that they are a new user who is being set up or being configured. So that led us to invent in the space and create some really cutting-edge new technology that's being adopted by a lot of enterprises around the world.
And in this situation of your family members getting their identity stolen, do you know how the hacker was able to find this information for the questions?
Yeah, it's all we would today call social engineering, which kind of old language might have just been being a con artist, right? Somebody was able to call a customer support number and pretend to be that family member, and that they were locked out of their account, that they couldn't access it, they couldn't log in, they got a new phone, various methods. And the well-intentioned help desk representative was doing their best to try and help get that person back into their account, or what they thought was their account. And it turned out it wasn't. And so it was true what we would now call social engineering that's kind of taken on new levels, particularly in the year since we founded the company, with the rise of Gen AI and deepfakes, which have given sort of these superpowers to bad actors who now have even more tools at their disposal when they're calling those customer support numbers and may be able to pretend with a different voice, or if that customer support rep requires a phone call or video call, they're able to even deceive their appearance so they look and sound like the person they're impersonating. So it's gotten wildly more sophisticated, and I'm really glad that we started solving this problem kind of before it got so big, because it let us get really, really good at preventing it.
Mm-hmm. And so, I'm thinking today people are more aware of this threats. I'm thinking in call centers and in different areas, we're trained on this, right? We're trained on hackers will try to do certain things. If this incident happened 5 years ago, what changes have you seen happen from the 5 years to now?
Yeah, training is really important, and it's sort of a fundamental in the cybersecurity lineup that you want to train certainly all of your personnel and people on those front lines and help desk roles or support roles. The challenge is often that the tools that they've had at their disposal to do this type of work have been very limited. Sometimes it's access to security questions. Let's say you're an employee in a medical device manufacturer or in any medical institution, or frankly even any corporate or organizational environment. People in IT who might be answering that support desk call often don't or shouldn't have access to things like your employment or HR files. So the type of questions that they even have to be able to ask you, the data is quite limited. And so they don't have great tools to know authentically who they're speaking with, let alone are they a human or which human. And on the other side, the bad actors have gotten more sophisticated by having new tools to try and deceive those help desk agents. So in the last few years, I think we've really seen a rise of a greater discrepancy between the tools that bad actors have and the lack of tools that help desk or support professionals have.
Yeah, it's digging deeper, and I think there's more and more things for them to manage, so it's hard to manage it all, right? So what I'd like to understand a bit more is when we transpose this to medical devices, how is social engineering a problem in medical devices? If we're talking about patients, for instance, and they need to authenticate, what are some risk scenarios that you imagine through this?
Well, I think what we found is that identity security is increasingly critical in the medical device space and in many spaces. So often identity was seen as something that was necessary, but not necessarily core to cybersecurity. And if you think of all the regulatory steps that we go through to make sure a medical device piece of hardware is safe, it's compliant, it's able to be used, we have to really think increasingly, what are the security or the cybersecurity frameworks that are created around it to help protect the access to the hardware because it can be life-threatening or life-critical, also to protect the data that's associated with coming from those devices. Increasingly, they're connected IoT medical devices or other things. So, as you know, medical devices now are really technology products. They often have software in addition to the hardware. And protecting that software and protecting the information and data that can be collected through that software has made it really foundational, is something critical to protect as part of the hardware.
Mm-hmm. And so if you were a medical device manufacturer and you're integrating not just your own software, but also third party and different capabilities, different layers, how do you work with such complexity in your authentication processes, and what are some controls that you can put in?
Well, I think it's really critical that people think about implementing strong, sort of phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And this can take many forms. Sometimes you might, as an end user, get a PIN code sent to you via SMS. That's considered a less secure method of doing multi-factor authentication because it relies on the telcos being very good at being able to protect their own networks and their own accounts. A bad actor can often get control of a phone number, and therefore they can take over things that are sent via SMS codes. So you really need more robust forms of multi-factor authentication, like authenticator apps or FIDO, advanced passkeys, and certificate-based access. They're more advanced forms of doing it, but you really want something that's kind of leading on the multi-factor authentication side itself. Another really emerging area that's become critical is this introduction of identity verification for high privileged access. And this is where particularly you see social engineering and impersonation attacks become the real threats. And so requiring things like ID verification, ideally a match to sort of biometrics, and giving that identity verification functionality to the help desk and the support workers that we were talking about, it helps ensure that sort of there's a human in the loop for those kind of sensitive moments like device unlocking and remote updates or patient data exports. And the last big area is often thinking about you can't trust the perimeter anymore. You can't trust that just because an authenticator app is set up or a ping is sent to someone when they're logging in, that it actually is the human that you intend to be accessing the network. And so you need these sort of continuous identity checks, not just at login time, but when there are moments of privileged access or things that might need sort of forms of step up.
And so if we have an engineering listening to this right now, how do you do it continuously? What are some things you can do?
Well, interestingly, a lot of the platforms and technologies that do multi-factor authentication, think platforms like Okta, for example, or Duo or Ping or Microsoft, they often have conditional forms of behavioral analytics to suggest, hey, something suspicious is going on, or this is an important ask. Let's make sure it's the person. Okta calls them enterprise access management. Let's make sure it's really still you, right? Kind of in short form. And so you can look at behavioral-based things to say, this is an important ask. Let's re-verify this person. And so then you get into, do you do maybe, let's say, what's default in Okta? Re-verify means get a ping to your Okta app and click yes. Or is there a moment to use a third-party authentication factor, like asking someone to re-verify with a selfie or to re-verify with their government ID and a selfie? Things that would help ensure that not just that the device which was enrolled is the person who's making this request, but the person behind the device. And so if you're in engineering, in medical device manufacturing, it's really critical to think about those moments and how you're going to solve for those step-up or privileged access moments.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different possibilities and scenarios, and it's important to develop your own analytics in order to understand what should be pushed. So we talked about different factors. We talked about SMS. We talked about FIDO, things like this. I'm thinking, though, because medical devices, they do amazing things. They extend life, which means that usually a lot of the users using these kind of products are folks who are older, who did not grow up with technology. And so if we have a need for some sort of authentication for people who are not necessarily understanding these types of devices in the same way you and I do, what are some authentication methods that you recommend?
Yeah, I think traditionally a lot of authentication or verification methods have actually been difficult to use. It's easy to think that security questions are something that anybody can answer, but actually that's not universal, and particularly for folks maybe later stage in life. Sometimes that question of what street did you live on in 1964 is actually a really hard or stressful question, let alone the
Yeah.
I can't remember, next question, next question. They become moments that are actually very stressful and aren't really improving the security value proposition. So you're kind of getting no benefit. The user is not happy, it's not fast, and by the way, it's not necessarily secure. And so trying to find more consistent ways, one of our theses or hypotheses has been that using things like your mobile device, let's say asking someone to take a selfie to re-verify themselves, is actually something that can be very user-friendly and can also bring great security benefit. And so that thinking about modern tools like the modern mobile phones can be easier to use in many ways. Bringing that functionality into the verification experience can let people of all demographics and ages kind of participate. And at the very least, one of the things that we found is if you can handle, say, 95% of your traffic by automating it and directing it to mobile and giving people self-service, high security, high convenience ways to do things, it allows you to focus your support resources on, let's say, the remaining 5%, on the people who might need accessibility support or extra time, or it allows you to dedicate more support resources to those people who the technology solutions might not be as accommodating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a trade-off between, the way I see it, there's a trade-off between difficulty of implementation, the user ability to do the authentication, and then lastly, the security that's brought into a certain authentication means. So it's always about measuring and understanding. So my question is, if you're in pre-market, you're designing your product, you're thinking about how it can work, how do you take into consideration all these different aspects and measure what ultimately is the best way for you to authenticate users?
Well, I think pre-market or established device provider today, it's part of thinking about what your value proposition is going to be in the market and what you're offering. And the hardware itself might have great functionality. The software components of it also might be really special and unique. But are you going to make cybersecurity one of the differentiators in your product? And I would say increasingly, particularly from a regulatory perspective, it matters. Today, we're seeing this huge influx in bad actors targeting medical institutions, medical devices, because there's higher value today in getting access to sensitive medical and patient data. We could get into why. What's clear is the fact that that's happening. The why is a little bit more speculative, and there are some interesting ideas around that. But I would argue if you were making a new product today, let alone if you haven't established one on the market, you really need to be thinking about fundamentally how to make cybersecurity one of your differentiators. To say, hey, I have a better product. You can trust not only the outcome it performs, but you can trust how it does it, with a focus on keeping patient data safe and knowing who the providers are or the practitioners that are using the devices and other things. I think that's a great opportunity in the market. And so I would think you should design these cybersecurity elements from day one to be core of your solution offering.
Yeah, and there's one thing that's the security of the medical device, and then there's the trust that you have to put in the solution that you bring into the medical device, right? Because if you think about it, when you have Okta on a system, you trust Okta that will do its job, and you need to of course, make sure that they're doing the right thing. So how, as a medical device, do you assess the different solutions that you may have to provide more security in that authentication space?
Yeah, increasingly, it's not just your device, it's the being compatible with what your customers might be using and what their environments might be using. If a customer is using Okta to protect a variety of devices in their ecosystem, then you want to support Okta. If they're using Duo or they're using Ping, you want to be interoperable and on standards that allow those kind of things to happen. So then for your own company and for your core solution offering, there aren't that many providers out there that kind of do this space of identity provisioning, account protection. And so you can narrow down quite quickly based on your geographic needs, based on your technology needs and what your stack is like. But if it were me, I would really probably prioritize for how most I can integrate with my customers. The people who are buying my medical device products, what are they going to want to use? Does my solution integrate well into their ecosystem? And that would probably help guide some of my choices.
Can you walk us through an example, a personal story of a successful implementation? What were some good things that the customer did in terms of choosing the right product? How would you recommend the medical device manufacturers to go about it?
Yeah, I think there's some key decision criteria often. People start with some of the decisions or thought process that you were hinting at earlier. Thinking about in our organization, are we going to prioritize security, or are we going to, how much friction are we willing to tolerate? What's our approach towards data handling and where people store data and how data is used? Do we have regulatory requirements around some of those things? How easy is this going to be to use from an end user experience? How much is this going to be core to our value proposition? Things like that are probably really healthy thought patterns as you're going in to solve the problem. Today, we work with a lot of different organizations in healthcare and in the private sector generally that have started often in workforce. So they often think about their own employees. And what we saw starting about 18 months ago, particularly out of the US, for whatever reason, MGM, the casinos and hotels in Las Vegas, became kind of the poster child for this. But there was a particular bad actor group called Scattered Spider. And Scattered Spider targeted MGM, and they targeted the employee IT help desk there, where someone called, bad actor called, pretended to be an employee who had special access, privileged access, and that they were locked out of their account. And the help desk rep did their best. They did what they could. But roughly 8 minutes later, the con artist, the impersonator, was able to socially engineer their way to getting that account reset and taking control. They then were able to access the network, deposit ransomware, and MGM went down for kind of 2 weeks. In those 18 months since, it has just been a wild epidemic of cyber attacks targeting many, many companies of all types, particularly through this vector, because it is unfortunately a gap in what's native to Duo or Entra, Microsoft, or Okta, or Ping. They don't have a solution for this. They have out-of-the-box great ways to do authentication or phishing-resistant authentication, but they don't actually have a way to do recovery. They don't have a way to do step-up in a high security way when you want to make sure it's still the person. They don't have a great way to do provisioning. How do you make sure that the person you're inviting to the network or to set up a piece of equipment is the person that you think they are? And so we found a way to supplement that, and that made a really big difference. But these companies are often now proactively trying to say, how do I solve for that risk that I know that exists? I've seen this bad actor, Scattered Spider, and many others, and many other copycats go after so many elements of private sector. And then about 12 months ago, we started getting these warnings in the healthcare space. We started getting them from multiple different US and European organizations saying bad actors are specifically targeting the medical space. They're specifically targeting medical device manufacturers. They're targeting hospitals, patient care platforms, anything related to the broad medical space. It's an area where government has been advising us. They've been very clear this is happening, and we are certainly seeing it behind the scenes in companies, educational institutions, and others that are trying to protect against it. And so there's this wave right now of attacks specifically targeting this category that we're talking about, where people are using these social engineering attacks to take over and access sensitive information.
Yeah, makes sense. The thing I think about it is it's a constant, right? The human is a constant. While our systems, different vulnerabilities will evolve, the human is always there and it's somewhat reliable. So you're talking about an interesting thing, the 5% left over. So if you can have an auto solution that automates the 95%, and then there's 5% that needs to be dealt with, like authenticated or no, it's confusing to me because you need a whole process in order to determine. You need to think about this beforehand. If this, then this. If not, then this. So how do you recommend doing such process, and how do you go about this, basically?
That's something we have a lot of experience in working with companies to do. But I come back to think about how it is before there's any automation. You often have a process. It's probably something you have in place today that is incredibly time-consuming, typically very expensive. If you think of the cost of a support ticket, if you think of the cost of a provider being locked out of their account and not being able to offer critical life-saving care, let alone to do their job if maybe they're not, kind of patient-facing, like it's incredibly expensive. And by the way, no one likes having to call their IT help desk and wait on hold and then maybe follow a process of getting on a video call, which is the recommended solution today, and try and get themselves straightened out and their account unlocked. And so typically there are processes in place today, and what we're doing is we're helping to automate those so that you don't need to always have that manual process. And that's why it becomes such a quick win. And then for those remaining percentage points, I think it's always helpful to have a backup process, which might be something like you were doing previously, although now maybe with much more resourcing and support, or to think about, to your point, how can that process get a little bit better? Typically what we see is that for those people that then choose a non-automated path, companies want to introduce more friction. They want to be able to use that extra bandwidth or capacity they have to say, hey, for whatever reason, someone's not doing the automated path. It could be a personal preference, it could be accessibility needs, or it could actually be a bad actor really trying very hard to get in. And so whatever it is, dedicating additional resources there. And, I was with a CISO earlier this week, and their point was just add more and more layers. If someone's I'm going to throw every layer I have at that person to really make sure that it is them, because for whatever reason, I can't trust my new automated process. I need extra assurance that in some cases we see people say it needs to be in person, for example. The option is automated, or hey, if you're not that, you need to come into our office, our branch, our medical center, our facility, and do something in person and show a government ID, maybe have a conversation with someone at a security desk. That level of assurance sometimes becomes necessary at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be pretty annoyed if someone told me you have to go to your bank to withdraw some money or to do whatever bank account you usually do. But if it means, reducing the odds of, I'd be willing to do it. But in medical devices, sometimes we don't have that luxury, right? It's to take the extreme example that I read once. A defibrillator, you can't have MFA on it. It needs to be triggered immediately. So thinking about less extreme example, perhaps something that you can take, let's say, a minute to authenticate. What are some ways that you can optimize the security while not disturbing the whole procedure of the medical device?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen people do is various levels of assurance and at different moments. And the defibrillator, sure, is maybe something you don't even log into, right? Like you want an embedded OS and you want to be able to grab it and begin to use it. But let's say that there was hey, as you're using this, we're going to capture a selfie the first time. Don't know anything else about you, but we're going to capture a selfie. And you immediately can provide life-saving care, right? Zero friction, go. But then maybe after, let's say, 10 minutes post, you start getting a beep that says, hey, for audit and compliance purposes, we need to know who used the machine. Right? There might be value then to say, hey, we need to know a little bit more information about you, or let's confirm the login, or for our usage tracker, we need to understand who the person was, who the human was that used this machine, right? Kind of handling it post. Maybe it's even just to access the logs or to make changes to that hardware, which is a non-critical life-saving moment. That's a moment when you want to add additional friction and make sure that someone's not tampering with the BIOS or adjusting the software or performing maintenance checks. So it's not to say at any moment, gosh, life critical care is on the line here, let's put in several hurdles and friction. But often it is those moments of rush, outside of a defibrillator example, that bad actors take advantage of, right? Where they say, oh gosh, I'm in the middle of something, I have to get back in, I'm locked out of my... They create the sense of urgency. No different than the employee who calls and says, I'm on vacation and there was just a reorganization and I don't even know who my manager is. I got to be able to access my email. Or I've got a critical a deal or a contractor. People use those moments and they create them fictitiously often to create a sense of urgency, to try and apply social engineering pressure. And so we have to be very thoughtful about what levels of access we're giving people and when we're creating the friction. But one of our big focuses is let's just make sure we can do this in a high assurance way that's remote. Because typically today there's a big gap between the assurance we can have when someone comes in person to a facility and the level of assurance that has traditionally happened remotely. So what we're trying to do is increase the assurance that can happen in a remote context. So you have more tools at your disposal.
Yeah, increase that trinity that we said about the trade-off between usability, implementation, and security, of course, try to optimize this. If you're an engineer listening to this conversation and you're having an awesome time, you want to implement such a system in your medical device. I want to understand how it works. I'm thinking that you have to have a mechanism that understands when to trigger a certain alert, right? To trigger a certain MFA, to try to understand what is the baseline behavior and compare it to what's actually going on at that moment. So how do you architect this whole thing?
That's not always a quick answer because I think that's a little bit more unique to maybe what you're building, particularly in the device space, because it can be different than typical software or SaaS provider. So I want to be sensitive to throw some things for consideration, but I don't know that there's like a pure playbook on it, so to speak. I think you need to be thinking about how to implement strong authentication, and that often involves using some form of multi-factor authentication. So that should be core in whatever you're trying to design for. Once you choose a platform or a product that does this, that will help you to protect the devices and to protect sort of the user accounts. Typically then those platforms, almost all of them, open source, private sector, you name it, have solutions embedded to help think about when those privileged, or to guide you through deciding what those step up or privileged access moments might be. So that's not often something you have to create from scratch. But by choosing your authentication platform, a lot of that technology then comes in afterwards. There are definitely other things you can use to enhance, and third-party platforms and behavioral analytics tool, a lot of fun stuff you can go to the next level on. But at the starting point, a lot of it exists in the platform. So first I would solve your authentication layer. Then I would think about identity proofing. And you need to ensure that new users or technicians onboarding into a system are verified humans, and that they are not bots or they are not impersonators. So you need to be thinking about ways to do identity proofing and what your process is going to be around that. Again, is it in person? Is it remote? If it's remote, how are you going to think through that? And traditionally, the technology that has done identity proofing has always been for consumers. It's always been in financial services what we call know your customer. Similarly, I open a bank account. In order to open a bank account, you need to provide an ID and take a selfie, let's say if it's remote. The challenge with that is it's always been technically in a web browser. Be on a mobile web browser or a desktop web browser. But by being in a web browser, it's unfortunately susceptible to manipulation. It's susceptible these days to someone using a deepfake to trick that process. And so it's really not built for security. It's not built for the level of identity proofing that you need for proper workforce or otherwise authentication. And so thinking deeply about the providers you're using and kind of looking at that space. My company, we spent a lot of time on this. We happened to invent something that was different than web-based. We are exclusively on mobile. We are the first to be on mobile. So we ask a user to scan their ID and take a selfie exclusively on a mobile device, which provides a completely different level of security. And that was one of our unique things. But whatever it might be, you need to be looking at that identity proofing layer. Another thing to think about often is audit trails. As every action on a device, as you know, particularly in our space, needs to be tied to a verified identity, and it should be logged for compliance or forensic purposes. There's a lot of guidance on this that's very real world. FDA, I think, has done a lot in the US, and they've done updates in recently as 2023, saying that the authentication of users, including the unique device identifiers, is essential for maintaining trust in the system. And then organizations like NIST, their cybersecurity framework provides templates for medical device manufacturers to follow, with identity security being part of the sort of protect and the detect functions. So there are good templates and blueprints out there, and there are good platforms, I think, to help get an engineer started.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, I understand a lot more now. It makes a lot of sense. But you talk about the way that it keeps evolving, and your company was started 5 years ago, and you told us how the landscape has changed. How do you see the next 5 years evolve in this regard?
Well, being very personally candidly, I thought identity was incredibly exciting, and when we started the company, I had this personal problem, and we started, how can we solve it with some new technology and innovation? And it was amazing. We built something really special, but I had no idea that identity would be as exciting and as fundamentally critical to cybersecurity as it's become.
Oh, wow.
And so these last few years have been really exciting, crazy, but scary. I mean, many emotions. But I feel even more committed that identity really is foundational in any security posture today. And trust, so right? Much of what we know in the world of online, digital, anything is all about trust. It's hard enough to trust someone in the physical world. It is incredibly hard to trust someone in the virtual world. And that all comes back to identity. Knowing who someone is, that it's actually them, that it's not a bot, that it's not a chat agent, that it's not an impersonator, is the fundamental difference between being able to trust someone or not in this digital domain. And I think that the next 5 years in identity are going to be even more exciting than the last.
Wow. That's incredibly interesting. All right, Aaron, thank you so much for this. If people want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
LinkedIn's probably our best place. We try and post a lot of content. We try and educate a lot on just what we're seeing and the types of attacks, on techniques that are being used. And welcome the conversation, welcome the feedback, and love hearing from folks.
Nametag, right? Nametag, and your website, I think, is
getnametag.com.
Getnametag.com. Wonderful. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was a really great conversation, Mathieu.